Welcome to Logistics Business Conversations, where we talk with key spokespeople in the logistics industry about topical issues. Hosted by Peter McLeod, editor of Logistics Business magazine.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening to this around the world. And thank you so much for joining us for the latest edition of Logistics Business Conversations. My name is Peter McLeod and I'm the editor of Logistics Business magazine. And it's my great pleasure to be the host of this podcast entitled Electric Freightway, Decarbonising the UK's HGVs. The transport, logistics and distribution sector is one of the most carbon hungry of all, given its overdependence on diesel-powered lorries. Hitachi ZeroCarbon wants that to no longer be the case and has pioneered a suite of solutions, both existing and future, to help businesses drive carbon out of their operations. Among the more interesting initiatives is one called Electric Freightway, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Colm Gallagher, Chief Data Scientist of Hitachi ZeroCarbon, to talk more about that. Hello, Colm, and welcome to Logistics Business Conversations.
Hi, Peter. Thanks very much for having me on.
You're very welcome. Now, I want you to tell me a little bit more about yourself before we get stuck into the conversation about Electric Freightway. A little bit about your role and a little bit about Hitachi ZeroCarbon, please.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think as you mentioned, I'm the Chief Data Scientist at Hitachi ZeroCarbon. To put a bit of context as to what that actually means, we're primarily a technology company with Hitachi ZeroCarbon, and we're focused on enabling fleets to decarbonize. So again, we look at the HGV space specifically. 20% of all UK transport emissions are coming from heavy goods vehicles. So we have a mix in terms of what we do. We do innovation programs, which I know we're going to speak at length about today. And then we also have some product offerings. So
what's the end game here, Colm? We've got, are we aiming for zero carbon by 2050? Is that the target and is that likely?
That's the goal. So again, if we focus on HGVs, obviously everyone's aware that post 2040, the government won't allow new sales of diesel HGVs. It seems like quite a bit away, but 15 years really, when we look at maybe the life cycle of a vehicle, it isn't that much. Today, it's really about taking the first steps in the space, but also building that plan for where you're going to be come 2040. And we're fully aware decarbonisation can have a few different solutions. So we're specifically focused on electric HGVs. But there will be other solutions that play also.
We've talked at length in logistics business about the seeming chicken and egg situation between the UK's charging infrastructure and the take-up of e-vehicles. What are your thoughts on that? You know, how can we nudge things along for one to create proliferation of the other?
Yeah, it's certainly very, very topical. I think you get opinions across a fairly broad spectrum. What I would say is I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So chicken and egg, it's a fair way of putting it. Programs like what we're involved with in Electric Freightway, it's putting both together. So it's not just putting vehicles on the road, it's also putting the charging infrastructure in place to support it. And it's probably been a learning for us over the last couple of years. You see certain customers who will go out and purchase the vehicles, which is fantastic, and then maybe face a few headaches when it comes to putting the infrastructure in place. So it's looking across the whole supply chain, if you want to put it that way. So getting the actual electricity from the grid right into the vehicles. So it's not just a vehicle-specific challenge that we're facing.
So before we go into Hitachi ZeroCarbon's specific role within the Electric Freightway project, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about some of the other stakeholders, about the structure of and makeup of Electric Freightway.
Absolutely. So it's ourselves and GridServe. So GridServe are the lead partner, and we're the principal partner. And then beyond that, it's a really large consortium. So we've got everything from the vehicle OEMs, so Volvo, Renault, DAF, I know Scania are coming on board. We also then have vehicle financiers, which is quite interesting because we're aware not everybody does an outright purchase. And then we've got quite a fantastic group of fleet operators. The key thing for us, I suppose, when we look at the consortium is it's large, but it's quite diverse. So we don't just want to see the same kind of archetype, should we say, fleet operator. Part of the reason this has been funded by DFT, it's to stimulate the wider industry and it's to stimulate adoption for electric HGVs. So when we start getting this diverse consortium put together, I think it's quite interesting that there's learnings across the industry as opposed to learnings for a specific subset.
It's a beautiful word to use on this occasion, but there will be a roadmap, I guess, and I would just wonder what that roadmap is, and indeed sort of the timelines you're going to be working around.
Yes, okay, I think that's pretty important. So as we are today, we are probably about 18 to 20 months into the program. In terms of numbers, it's going to fund in total by the end about 120 electric HGVs on the road and a similar number of chargers. So the chargers are split between depot charging infrastructure, so within a fleet operator's estate, and also the public charging infrastructure. I think if we maybe for a second focus on what everyone's probably familiar and what's visible, which is the passenger car market. You can see now news articles in terms of EV sales. It's quite visible when you're driving on the road. It's a hybrid, I suppose, is needed when we talk of charging infrastructure. And again, for the kind of personal use case, ideally people will charge their vehicles at home, and then for certain trips that they take, they'll also rely on the public charging infrastructure. So for HGVs, it's very similar. You need both, and you can't necessarily be reliant on one. So that's where that comes in. When we look at roadmaps, so from Hitachi's perspective, we have about another year and a half on the program. Our role always in these, you might wonder, I suppose, because we're not necessarily, selling the assets. We're really kind of data collectors, analyzers, and then releasing the insights. We've done this previously. So previously, our main background around innovation would be similar programs, but slightly different types of vehicles. So the most recent one we did was a program called Optimize Prime, which has absolutely zero relation to the Transformers movie, but it was the world's largest commercial EV trial. So that was ourselves, UK Power Networks, Uber, Royal Mail, and Centrica. So that was 8,000 vehicles on the road. And it's really, really interesting when we talk about uncertainty and kind of opinions and bias. What we really like to do is we take data from these vehicles operating on the roads in the UK, and you see exactly how they perform. And everyone has questions, and the questions could be, what are the operating costs? What are the challenges I face around charging? When you start putting data behind these questions to answer them, it takes away that uncertainty. And I think then industry has a roadmap going forward.
So yes, data is king, and so often I'm saying that in the world of logistics. So you're measuring the efficiency and performance of existing fleets and using that as an argument to accelerate investment in those fleets, I guess. Is that a fair sort of overview?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I suppose if we look at it from the Department for Transport's point of view, I think it's quite bold, but it's quite innovative, really, that they're putting this funding in place to, as we say, kind of kickstart the industry when we talk about decarbonisation. So to ensure that the UK's fleets are in a really positive position come 2040. But equally, I think when we look beyond the UK, this is companies in the UK innovating, finding what works, finding the answers, and that really gives a competitive advantage beyond it. So I think there's a big benefit there for UK PLC. So
does the technology exist today to electrify the UK's freight industry, and therefore it's just a question of economics and practicalities, or are there still a few little pieces of the jigsaw that we need to put in place before we can say we're ready to roll? I would say largely the technology is there. It's probably a good time now. What I should do is clarify the specific subsector of HGVs. So we're looking at 38 to 44 ton HGVs. So the heavier side of heavy goods vehicles. There's been some successful trials in the past. The BET trial was looking at the 19-ton rigid vehicles. But specifically when we look at the heavier side, the technology is there. I think there's some really cool vehicles available. The charging infrastructure is in place. It's really now, the pieces of the puzzle are available. It's understanding how do we construct the puzzle? And as you say, from an economic point of view, what's the least cost solution when it comes to this? And so what are the specific challenges, would you say, to the rollout, or what are going to be the hurdles that you have to overcome, or the significant hurdles? I think we're fortunate to an extent. Like, the industry is at very much the starting point when we come to this. So the vehicles going out on the road now,
especially if we look at maybe say the Renault, that's a new line, and these are the first of those vehicles hitting the road in the UK. And that's pretty much the same for the other OEMs also. The challenges are, we kind of have a blank canvas. There's definitely a different set of decisions that need to be made and that need to be thought about from a purchasing point of view and from an operations point of view. We say this, it's a blank canvas, but there's also a huge amount of learnings we can take from other parts of transportation. So if we look at buses, I think in the bus industry, in particular city buses, there's been really great progress there. So we have an understanding about what actually works, and it's a similar scale in terms of the batteries. Equally, I think every day I look out the window here, there's an electric Amazon vehicle or a DPD vehicle doing deliveries. So there's been a lot done. So there's learnings there. I think from the blank canvas perspective, maybe if you put yourself in the shoes of an operator who needs to purchase vehicles, you now have to consider battery capacity, the kind of the duty cycle of your vehicle in terms of payload and where it goes. So that's on the vehicle side. Then if we kind of come back to that chicken and egg, when we look at the charging infrastructure side, it's where do you actually need chargers? How many do you need? What sort of power? So we look at AC versus DC. And then finally, it's that makeup of public charging infrastructure. So that is essential to unlock the more difficult to electrify routes.
Colm, is it fair to say that the UK's, we could say geography or geology helps a project of this scale? But we have finite borders. We know when we talk about plotting a freight route from point A to point B, we know that the maximum parameters that we're talking about in that scenario. So is the UK an absolutely perfect place to roll out a project such as this?
It is quite nice, I think we have to say, largely because there's a diverse set of, let's call it duty cycles, I suppose, in terms of what these vehicles do, but it is bounded. So bounded by the borders effectively. I think if we look at it that way, I think when we look at it that way, the UK is effectively a really nice space to develop these solutions. Maybe jumping into a little bit of what we do in Hitachi ZeroCarbon, we talk about being data collectors. What does that actually mean? So when we look at about 120 of these electric HGVs on the road, we effectively pull the telemetry data from each of these vehicles. So, an example would be every minute, where is the vehicle? What's the speed? What's the efficiency at that moment in time? So you pull this, you do the same for the diesel vehicles that they're replacing, just to get an understanding of kind of what the baseline is. And effectively you can kind of map out the fingerprint of where these vehicles operate. And it is really interesting when you start to overlay that with obviously the map of the UK, and it starts to identify hotspots. So the one I kind of thought which was cool lately was, where do drivers who drive diesel vehicles today stop for their mandatory breaks? And you really start seeing these clusters across the UK. And if you look at it from a design perspective, the clusters of where the drivers are stopping today is a really good indicator of where we need public electric HGV infrastructure for charging. So it's fitting it in with what works today. So if the drivers currently stop, and of course they're going to stop in a place they find comfortable with good services, that's a fantastic opportunity to charge that vehicle. So why not have infrastructure in place? And I think that's where the opportunity lies, that it's really finding a solution that fits the needs of the industry, and it's not mandating something that doesn't quite fit. There will be a certain amount of change required. Sometimes it's behavioral change. Sometimes it's just a new learning with a new technology. But I think you have to fundamentally, come back to the point. The main goal of these vehicles is delivering goods and services across the UK. I think you need to keep that as the main goal. And decarbonisation needs to fit within this and really make sense, both logistically and economically.
Right, absolutely. So you're not asking the industry to change the way it behaves or to change its patterns of the way it does business. The EV battery is a sophisticated piece of kit, and it's something I've learned from reporting on the warehouse industry and specifically primarily around forklift truck batteries, there's as much technology in them as there is in the rest of the vehicle altogether, specifically around sort of optimizing the charge cycles and also the discharge of the battery, the way it performs to its sort of optimum standard. So what sort of technologies are we talking about here that Hitachi bring in, and where's the expertise from your perspective there?
I think it's a really important point to touch on. Sometimes if you look at this maybe from the perspective of the fleet operator today with the diesel vehicles, when you start introducing a new technology and there's a new set of decisions to think about, it doesn't necessarily mean a whole new set of expertise needs to be brought into that company. So that's largely where we play. There's software solutions out there that will take care of those decisions for you. If we focus maybe on the charging itself, so the charging is quite different. As we say, obviously it's a longer duration sometimes from your typical refueling today. But with that comes a pretty cool opportunity. So simple case today, the price of diesel across the 24 hours today will largely be pretty static. So you refuel whenever you like effectively. If we compare that to electricity prices here in the UK, they're changing every hour. And with that, there's good times to charge and there's more expensive times to charge. So we look at it from the point of view of, with our software, I should probably mention ZeroCarbon Charge, it's a full charge management system and it's automated. So it knows obviously when a vehicle plugs in and it knows when a vehicle needs to leave again the next morning. So effectively, it brings that vehicle to the level of charge it requires at the least cost. To maybe kind of jump to an extreme solution, but this does happen throughout the winter in the UK in particular. We actually get the examples of negative energy prices. So in this case, although it sounds a bit ridiculous, you're actually being paid to consume energy. So the refueling is, in a bizarre way, revenue generating. Obviously, you need to introduce, standing charges and tax into that, but that's a fairly cool example, I think, of completely shifting the paradigm when we look at recharging vehicles.
That's come as a real surprise to me to hear that expression. I know obviously you're not getting paid to use electricity as you described, but so what affects these peaks and troughs in the pricing, in this dynamic pricing? What are the factors that your data then looks at to help operators achieve the most efficient recharging costs?
Yeah, it really means from an OpEx perspective, you can be looking at reductions of 25% of charge costs if you do it in a smart way. We do this a lot at the moment across the UK with the bus industry. So we have a rollout of over 400 chargers for First Bus in the UK across several different locations. And taking the bus as an example, we know when that bus needs to leave the next day, or it could be the same day. So then you have your constraint and you say, okay, it's plugged in now and it needs to be gone in X hours time. It also needs a certain amount of energy. When should I deliver it? And you correspond that to the energy prices. And you do this day after day, and there's going to be days with smaller opportunities depending on what the prices are. But recently, like early January, we've been hitting record energy prices. So the higher those prices go, really, the more of an opportunity there is for reducing your operational expenses. But again, I think just to reiterate, this is something that's really, from a software perspective, can be automated. But if the upside for you as a fleet operator is reduction in OpEx, and I think that's all you need to be concerned about in terms of your fleet is ready to go when you need it to go, but your operational expenses are minimized.
That's an absolutely solid argument, Colm. But the secondary part of that should be also the wish and the desire to run a green fleet and to reduce carbon out of the operations, as well as reducing your operational costs. Perhaps it's not Hitachi's area of expertise because you're more on the operational side. But what about green energy? And how can a business charge its fleet in the knowledge that energy hasn't come from burning coal somewhere along the line?
It's a great point, actually. So we do have, within Hitachi ZeroCarbon, we have a team which is focused on the supply of energy, so the connection to the grid. Whether you source your energy from the grid directly or self-generation on site with technologies like solar PV. From my point of view, because selfishly I'm focused on the data and optimization, it's how you define what your goal is. So it could be the goal of person A to completely minimize cost, regardless of where energy comes from. But what would be a far nicer goal, which you can program quite easily, is minimize cost, but also minimize carbon. And what's quite nice is you will typically find, not always, but there is a really strong relationship between the price of energy and how carbon intensive it is. So again, as I mentioned lately in January with those very high energy prices, that's largely been driven because the gas power plants are coming online, and these are expensive gas peaker plants. So the relationship between the two is there. So lower energy prices typically means lower carbon. So again, you don't have to do as much thinking about it as you may have thought previously.
So I want to step up or step away a little bit, Colm, and step away from the specifics and talk more generally. Where is this desire to drive carbon coming from? Is it legislation that's forcing the operators into this sort of change of the way they operate, or is it something that the consumers are insisting upon, or is it a bit of both kind of answer to that?
I would say primarily legislation. So obviously the ban on diesel HGVs coming into play in 2040 is, like, I think anyone in the industry is going to acknowledge that's something that's really facing them head on. But equally, there's a lot of people in the industry that are, companies driving this for carbon reasons, which I think is really fantastic to see. So Amazon had a big announcement lately in terms of a purchase of up to 150 HGVs that are fully electric. And again, it comes down to individual companies, but I think one example in the consortium is a company in the north of England who they're not actually operating any HGVs themselves, but they're one of our key partners because they have third-party logistics companies coming to their site every day. They're part of their supply chain. So this company, if they want to decarbonize their supply chain, they need to enable their partners. So how they're doing this is they're putting charging infrastructure in place on their site. They're making that investment, and it means their logistics partners can then electrify their fleets. As they come to their site, they can recharge and leave again. And I think from kind of a listener's point of view, you may not be directly involved in purchasing of vehicles, operating vehicles, but it's a really good kind of lesson. I would have thought that you don't have to be directly involved. It could be that third party element and it's enabling it. And from your point of view then, we talk about scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions. That unlocks a whole lot for you.
Colm, as a self-confessed, selfish data guy, I'm going to take you outside of your comfort zone here and move you away from fact.
Let's go for it.
Ask you a little bit about opinion. So in this industry, there are dinosaurs, obviously. The old guys who say, this is a load of rubbish. Obviously there'll be climate deniers as well. Throw it in there. So what can you say to these people to sort of help win, what can we say, hearts and minds when it comes to this extraordinary transformation that the industry is certainly going to have to go through? Yeah,
so I think putting it as extraordinary transformation is quite a nice way of phrasing it. It's change, and I think we're all a little bit resistant to change at times. So it's about bringing people along the journey. Within the Electric Freightway program, we have a whole work package which is looking at this kind of behavioural side of things and what the opinions of people in the industry are. So from my point of view, I'd always look at the data point, and the data point could be the speed of the vehicle, the position, which is great, but that's obviously one side of things. It's also the kind of the qualitative side of things. So we're going out and we're interviewing the drivers, the vehicle purchasers, the senior management in these companies. We're doing this before they get vehicles and after they get vehicles, and it's trying to understand how these perceptions and opinions are changing. So one thing that's come out quite recent is, and we're at the earlier stages of this, obviously, with the vehicles currently being put on the road, there's a bit of a delta between the senior management supporting the move to electric vehicles and less of the drivers. So currently what we've seen is about 66% of senior management are really supporting this, whereas the drivers are lagging behind with about 40%. And I think that's something that's important to put out there because it does highlight they need to be brought on this journey too. If they have concerns, we need to publicise through the programme what these concerns are. And I think if we look at the output of all this, so we take all this data, whether it's from the vehicles or from the opinions in the industry, we're publishing a set of reports along the way. The intention here is, okay, if you're in the industry, you can pick up these reports and apply the learnings to your particular use case. But equally, from a government policy perspective, if there's challenges there that policy can address, it means you can define really targeted policy, and it takes away that uncertainty again.
In my travels around across the logistics industry, I once visited a forklift truck manufacturer, and one of their 3 principal designers was an anthropologist who knew nothing about forklift trucks, but also however, knew everything about human behavior. So it does sound perhaps, across the industry, change management is required. And, the sort of the anthropological approach is we cannot push this onto people who are not going to be receptive to it. It has to be a very much, a powerful argument in favor of it happening. And that way you bring people on board. And it looks like, judging by the sort of the consultative approach that Hitachi ZeroCarbon is taking, it sounds like you're fully aware of that as a potential challenge, and you're aware of how to overcome that.
Yes. So I think the easiest thing that maybe mentioned up front is we fully acknowledge the capital investment required for these vehicles is higher compared to the diesel equivalent. That's easy. I think, you can see that at the front. But what we're looking at is what's the cost of operating these over the lifetime of the vehicle. So like the total cost of ownership. And when you start to compare that for the diesel vehicles with the electric equivalents, I think that's where things get pretty interesting, because if it's a really compelling argument for electric HGVs over the lifetime of the vehicle, then it becomes far harder to push back again, should we say, because, financially it just makes sense. So, a few things we take into account here. We look at, for the diesel case, the maintenance cost, the cost of fuel over a number of years, expected lifetime. And then you come to the electric case, and you can see the cost of electricity, obviously, the capital cost of the charging infrastructure. But as we mentioned earlier, with, the energy prices, some really cool opportunities around revenue generation. And that's going to be our key published finding when we come out of all this. So the final report, or one of our final reports, will come out around December, and it's really going to be mapping out exactly what these cost and how they stack up against each other. I
hope I'll be retired by the time this comes to fruition, if my plan comes off. However, there are no guarantees in this world. One of the things that I would want to do is just perhaps play devil's advocate here and say, historically, the UK perhaps, is it fair to say, hasn't been very good at delivering significant infrastructural projects on time and on budget. Think Wembley Stadium, think HS2, Crossrail, those sorts of things. How optimistic should I or should I not be that 2050 is? I'll be sitting in a service area off the M1, and it'll be just water dripping out of the tailpipes of these vehicles, or just pure the hum of electric engines all around me. Or how much will I be sort of sitting there ruining that we didn't grasp the nettle and take advantage of the opportunity to do this when we had the chance to?
I'd kind of use this example. A lot of what we do in work, obviously, is forecasting. So you're trying to forecast what the demand might be tomorrow, or where the vehicle might need to go to. Every forecast, especially when we look towards 2050, is going to be wrong. And the right answer really is, who is the least wrong? I think it's quite sure there's going to be a makeup of different technologies here. What we're seeing so far is the electric HGVs, they just make sense in a huge amount of cases. So I think we speak about the duty cycle of these vehicles. A key requirement for the Department for Transport was that we start testing what are the really difficult ones to electrify, so you can map out the kind of boundaries today as to where things work and where things don't work. And it's quite surprising. So like one example, we're doing some analysis on a couple of vehicles operating in the Midlands. They're going out, they're doing their normal days operations, and they're coming back with 40% state of charge in the vehicle. So that's really indicating they can do a lot more, or a vehicle with a smaller size battery can do the same work. That just fits in and it slots and it works today. Obviously, as the program matures, we'll start understanding where the challenges lie. And that's really where technology can address things, and change may come into place too. This is probably sounding like a very avoidance-based answer, but I can't say exactly what's going to happen in 2050, but I'm personally quite confident electric HGVs are a really critical part of that solution.
Well, Colm, you've managed to reawaken the optimist in me with that answer, so thank you for that. Well, looking at the clock, I think we're running out of time now. I just wanted to sign off, perhaps, ask you to sign off, Colm, if you would, with, what are the next steps, and how can interested parties reach out to you and learn more about moving this whole decarbonisation project forward?
Yes. So I think next steps, the infrastructure rollout will roll on, should we say? Pardon the fun. So the vehicles are on the road today. There will be more and more of them hitting the road over the next number of months. Some of the consortium members are actually branding them specifically around kind of, I suppose, green livery. So you'll start to see that. I think drivers in the industry will start seeing the chargers pop up around some of the more popular service hubs that they stop in. From Hitachi's perspective, we're really, and this is where we kind of always come into play, we take, if we look at a vehicle can give us 1 million data points in a day. It's how do you actually distill that into answering a question the industry has? So that's where we're publishing the reports. So 2 of them exist at the moment, available on our website, Hitachi ZeroCarbon.com. Then we'll continue to do this as the program matures and we get a more final set of results. And that's actually it. Probably worth mentioning, we will finish up in about 12 to 18 months' time in the program. Obviously, these vehicles stay on the road and it's really a requirement. Funding comes in play to power fund these vehicles, and what the government gets back and what I suppose wider industry gets back is the data from these. So that will continue to roll on for a 7-year period for each vehicle.
Well, we look forward to tracking that at Logistics Business, and we're well on board with your initiative. I wish you all the very best, Colm, with the Electric Freightway project and everything that lies beyond that. And it just remains for me to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Colm Gallagher, Chief Data Scientist at Hitachi ZeroCarbon. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem. Thank you, Peter.
And before I go, I want to ask you, the listener, to check out our back catalogue of Logistics Business Conversations, wherever you get your podcast from. And remember to subscribe in order to be the first to be notified whenever we post new content. So on behalf of Logistics Business and Hitachi ZeroCarbon, it's thank you and goodbye. And we hope to see you again for the next edition of Logistics Business Conversations. Thank you and goodbye.